Welcome to For Your Health, Dr. Syed Salim. Do you know an athlete who died at the peak of his athletic glory? These are the most famous athletes who were killed by sports in association with hidden diseases.
Pheidippides, 40 years old. In 490 BC. Marathon. David Wilson, 23 years. In 1906. Football. Lyle Downs, 24 years. In 1921. Football. Frank Hayes, 22 years. In 1923. Horse racing. Frank Warfield, 35 years. In 1932. Baseball. Stan Malden, 27 years. In 1948. Football. Herb Gorman, 28 years. In 1953. Baseball. John Kirkby, 23 years. In 1953. Football. Dave Sparks, 26 years. In 1954. Football. Dixie Howell, 40 years. In 1960. Baseball. Petr Radakovich, 29 years. In 1966. Football. Victor Blinoff, 22 years. In 1968. Ice hockey. Wayne Larkin, 29 years. In 1968. Ice hockey. Chuck Hughes, 28 years. In 1971. Football. Pedro Berruezo, 27 years. In 1973. Football. Pava, 26 years. In 1973. Football. Nikola Mantov, 23 years. In 1973. Football. Otto Curie, 24 years. In 1977. Football. Luciano Vendemini, 24 years. In 1977. Basketball. J. V. Kane, 28 years. In 1979. Football. Omar Sarnoon, 24 years. In 1980. Football. Raul Lavonen, 28 years. In 1981. Ice hockey. Carl Morton, 39 years. In 1983. Baseball. Larry Gordon, 28 years. In 1983. Football. Flo Hyman, 31 years. In 1986. Volleyball. Pete Maravich, 40 years. In 1988. Basketball. Samuel Okwaragi, 25 years. In 1989. Football. David Longhurst, 25 years. In 1990. Football. Hank Gathers, 23 years. In 1990. Basketball. Reggie Lewis, 27 years. In 1993. Basketball. Michael Klein, 33 years. In 1993. Football. Bruno Pezzé, 39 years. In 1994. Football. Sergei Grinkov, 28 years. In 1995. Figure skating. Hedy Burkissa, 24 years. In 1997. Football. Stephen Moyne, 29 years. In 1998. Ice hockey. Robbie James, 40 years. In 1998. Football. C. Thielen Hilden, 24 years. In 2000. Football. Conrad McRae, 29 years. in 2000. Basketball. Darryl Kyle. 33 years. In 2002. Baseball. Mark Vivian Foe. 28 years. In 2003. Football. Brad Rohn. 34 years. In 2003. Boxing. Miklos Feiha. 24 years. In 2004. Football. Cristiano Jr. 25 years. In 2004. Football. Cormac McAnallen. 24 years. In 2004. Football. Sergei Zoltaks. 31 years. In 2004. Ice. Derek Faison. 36 years. In 2004. Football. Serginho. 30 years. In 2004. Football. Thomas Heion. 23 years. In 2005. Football. Jason Collier. 28 years. In 2005. Basketball. Hugo Cunha. 28 years. In 2005. Football. Eddie Guerrero. 38 years. In 2005. Wrestling. Scott Mason. 28 years. In 2005. Cricket. Mohammed Abdelwahab. 22 years. In 2006. Football. Matt Gadsby. 27 years. In 2006. Football. Rasmus Green. 26 years. In 2006. Football. Nilton Pereira Mendez. 30 years. In 2006. Football. Ryan Shea. 28 years. In 2007. Marathon. Darcy Robinson. 26 years. In 2007. Ice hockey. Antonio Pueda. 22 years. In 2007. Football. Damian Nash. 24 years. In 2007. Football. Chasway Nsofwa. 28 years. In 2007. Football. Jesse Marooned. 27 years. In 2007. Weightlifting. Joe Kennedy. 28 years. In 2007. Baseball. Phil O'Donnell. 35 years. In 2007. Football. Mickey Renaud. 19 years. In 2008. Ice hockey. Georgia Kolonix. 36 years. In 2008. Canoeing. Heath Benedict. 24 years. In 2008. Football. Marvin Stone. 26 years. In 2008. Basketball. Ginty Reed. 22 years. In 2008. Kickboxing. Alexei Cherapanov. 19 years. In 2008. Ice hockey. Victor Hugo Avalos. 37 years. In 2009. Football. Daniel Jarque. 26 years. In 2009. Football. Gabor Oxkay. 33 years. In 2009. Ice hockey. Frederick Nolf. 21 years. In 2009. Cycling. Sebastian Feist. 20 years. In 2009. Handball. Gaines Adams. 26 years. In 2010. Football. Jose Lima. 37 years. In 2010. Baseball. Endurance Idaho. 25 years. In 2010. Football. Igor Misko. 23 years. In 2010. Ice hockey. Bob Sam Elagico. 30 years. In 2011. Football. Naoki Matsuda. 34 years. In 2011. Football. Robert Traylor. 34 years. In 2011. Basketball. Jawad Akada. 28 years. In 2012. Football. Mitchell Cole. 27 years. In 2012. Football. Alexander Dale Owen. 26 years. In 2012. Swimming. Pier Mario Morosini. 25 years. In 2012. Football. Siku Kamara. 27 years. In 2013. Football. Chandler Williams. 27 years. In 2013. Football. Alex Marquez. 20 years. In 2013. Football. Alan Pamick. 23 years. In 2013. Football. Shane Del Rosario. 30 years. In 2013. MMA. Christian Gomez. 27 years. In 2015. Football. David Onia. 30 years. In 2015. Football. Gilbert Bulawin. 29 years. In 2016. Basketball. Ben Idris Aderm. 34 years. In 2016. Football. Patrick Ekeng. 26 years. In 2016. Football. Bernardo Ribeiro. 26 years. In 2016. Football. Sheikh Tayod. 30 years. In 2017. Football. Fab Melo. 26 years. In 2017. Basketball. Neil Fingleton. 36 years. In 2017. Basketball. Davido Astorai. 31 years. In 2018. Football. Zeke Upshaw. 26 years. In 2018. Basketball. Michael Gulitz. 23 years. In 2018. Cycling. Frankie de la Cruz. 37 years. In 2021. Baseball. Rafael Dwamena. 28 years. In 2023. Football. Jacoby Jones. 40 years. In 2024. Football. Modja Sarkic. 26 years. In 2024. Football. Please. Know everything about your heart before you exercise. To save your life. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Until we meet again. Be safe.